Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you once again for being on our Bible study call tonight. We are continuing our study of the book of Genesis. Last week, we really concluded the story of Jacob. I mean, he'll come up again later on towards the end of the book, but um, for the most part, the major role that he has played is kind of done at this point. And we've transitioned the narrative now to his son Joseph. And Joseph is his beloved son. Of his 12 sons, he's the one that he loves the most. And his brothers were very envious of him. And in our last meeting, we saw them sell his brother, sell Joseph, into slavery, and the caravan takes him to Egypt, where he becomes the servant of a man named Potiphar, who is an established dignitary in Egypt. So that's where we're going to pick up the story today, with chapter 38 of the book of Genesis. Really, we're getting close. We're coming towards the end of the book. We're in the last 13 chapters, so we probably will have another 2 or 3 gatherings after tonight. So we're drawing to the end. So congratulations to all of you for hanging in there. Hope you've found it beneficial. So we're going to start in chapter 38. So chapter 38 is actually a little sidebar, really, from the Joseph story. So immediately after they sell Joseph to slavery in Egypt, we get this kind of strange and awkward and uncomfortable story about Judah and Tamar, but it has connections with the New Testament too. So let's read through it and see what's going on and see what really the significance of this story is. So in chapter 38 of the book of Genesis, we read, "It came to pass at that time that Judah departed from his brothers." So Judah is one of the 12 brothers. So now he goes on his own, "and visited a certain Adullamite whose name was Hirah. Then Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he married her and went into her. So she conceived and bore a son and called his name Er. She conceived again and bore a son and called his name Onan. She conceived yet again and bore a son and called his name Shelah. She was at Chezib when she bore them." Now we've seen throughout this whole book, right, when the nation of Israel marries outside of the clan, so to speak, that bad things happen. So Judah here, he goes off on his own and he marries the daughter of a Canaanite, and he has 3 sons. So now let's see what's going to happen to these 3 sons. In verse 6, we read, "Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar." So the firstborn son is now married. "But Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord, and God killed him." So Tamar's husband dies because of his wickedness. "So Judah said to Onan, 'Go into your brother's wife and marry her, and as her brother-in-law, raise up seed to your brother.'" So this is really one of those things that's, culturally speaking, is very odd, for us to hear, because like that's not how we do things, right? Like if my brother dies, like I don't marry his widow, to raise up children for him. But in the Jewish customs, this is what would have been done, if a brother died without children, specifically in that scenario, if a brother died without children, then the other brothers, the next brother in line, in other words, would have married the widow to raise up children for the dead brother. So those children would not have been considered the children of their biological father in a legal sense. They would have been the children of their original father who has died. So this also comes up in the New Testament. If you remember the passage where Jesus is challenged by the Pharisees regarding the woman who married the 7 brothers. It was this exact scenario that they were talking about. So the Pharisees present the scenario where there are 7 brothers, and the first one marries, but he dies without children, and they all die. They all are married to her because each of them dies in succession before having children. And then they say in heaven, who is her husband, And Christ stumps them by saying in heaven they're not given as husbands and wives like we are here on earth, but they're like angels, and he kind of shuts them up. So we see this exact scenario come up again in the New Testament, with the Pharisees challenging Christ. So this is the same kind of thing that we're talking about. So now Judah tells his second son, go and marry your brother's widow and raise up children for him. Now in verse 9, but Onan knew the seed would not be his. So in other words, he knew that the child would not really be his heir, and he would have to, provide for it and take care of it. And it came to pass that whenever he went into his brother's wife, he emitted his semen on the ground, lest he should give seed to his brother. But the thing he did appeared evil in the sight of the Lord. Therefore, he also put him to death. So Onan acts very wickedly in this situation. Instead of fulfilling his brotherly obligation, according to common practices at that time, he acts in a way to prevent Tamar from having a child. So this is not pleasing in the sight of the Lord because of his deceit, because of his wickedness, and unwillingness to um, his unwillingness to provide his legal duty, basically, which is to raise up children for his dead brother. Again, this is one of those passages that makes us a little uncomfortable. We're probably, actually, if we haven't read this before, we're probably surprised that it's in the Bible, right? So now two brothers have died. The first brother, and now Onan is also dead. So Tamar has burnt through two of the brothers, and there's one left. So in verse 11, Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house till my son Shelah is grown. For he said, lest he also die like his brothers. So Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. So Tamar goes back home waiting for Shelah to come of age so she can marry him. Now in the process of time, the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died. So now Judah is a widower. His wife is also dead. And Judah was comforted and went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah, he and his shepherd Hirah the Adullamite. So it was told Tamar, saying, look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So that now she's going to put her master plan into action, because so far she's been treated very poorly, right? Her first husband dies. That's not her fault. He dies because of his wickedness. She marries a wicked man. She probably had no choice in the matter. She marries a wicked man. He dies. The brother refuses to fulfill his brotherly obligations to raise up children. So he dies, and her father-in-law refuses to give the third brother to her as well. So now she's going to put a plan into action to kind of even the playing field a little bit. So in verse 14, thus she took off her widow's garments, covered herself with a veil, made herself beautiful, and sat down near the gates of Anan on the way past Timnah, for she saw Shelah was grown, and she was not given to him as a wife. So Shelah has come of age, but Judah has not given him over, to her to be her husband, and so she knows that she's being wronged by Judah, just as she has been really throughout this whole process. Chapter 15, when Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute because she had covered her face, and he did not recognize her. Then he turned to her by the way and said, let me come in to you, for he did not know she was his daughter-in-law. So she said, what will you give me that you may come in to me? He replied, I will send a young goat from the flocks. So she said, will you give me a pledge till you send it? Then he said, what pledge shall I give you? So she said, your ring and cord and the staff in your hand. Then he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. So she rose and went away and laid aside her veil and put on the garments of her widowhood. So her plan is that she disguises herself as a prostitute, and she coaxes Judah to have relations with her, and she conceives. She conceives the child that's owed to her by this family, in other words, in a legal sense, so to speak. So we see Judah act inappropriately here, taking on a prostitute, even though he's a widower. Obviously, this is not very virtuous or righteous action. But we'll see why this is important when we get to the end of the story. Thus Judah sent the young goat by the hand of his shepherd, the Adullamite, to receive his pledge from the woman. So now Judah is making his payment so he can get his cord and his seal and his staff back. Because at that time, a seal would have been something that would have identified the owner. If you ever watch, old movies from that, or not old movies, but movies from that are period pieces from like 18th, 19th century England, they write letters, they pour wax on the letter on the envelope, and then they stamp it with a seal, right? So this is the same idea here, that Judah would have had a seal that would have been unique to him and would have identified him as the owner of that seal. So now he sends the goat, which was the agreed upon payment, so that he can get his stuff back. But the shepherd did not find her. So we're in verse 21. Then he asked the men of that place, saying, "Where is the prostitute who was in Anan by the roadside?" They replied, "There was no prostitute here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I cannot find her." Also the men of the place said no prostitute had been there. Then Judah said, "Let her have them, lest we should become a laughingstock, for I sent this young goat, but you did not find her." So he realizes that, if he keeps asking around, people are going to realize what he did, and he's going to be a mockery, for what he had done. So at least there's some sense of his guilt there, that he did something wrong. Thus it came to pass about 3 months later that Judah was told, saying, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has committed fornication and is pregnant because of her adultery." So Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." When she was brought out, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, "By the man to whom these belong, I am with child." So she said, "Determine whose these are, the ring, the cord, and the staff." So Judah acknowledged them and said, "She has been more righteous than I, because I did not give her to Shelah my son," but he never knew her again. So she gets even in the end of the day. She gets even. So she presents, as Judah is getting ready to condemn her for her sin. She brings out the articles that belong to him and says, "Oh, this is the man that impregnated me," and he realizes what had happened, and in the end, she's justified because Judah had acted poorly towards her, not giving his third son to her to marry her, and had done this unrighteous thing. So the whole situation it's like soap opera material. But let's see now how the story ends up and how this ties back into the New Testament. So in verse 27, then it came to pass at the time for giving birth that behold, twins were in her womb. So she has twins now. So it was when she was giving birth that the one put out his hand, and the midwife took a scarlet thread and bound it on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." Then it happened as he drew back his hand that his brother came out unexpectedly. And she said, "How did you break through? This breach be upon you." Therefore she called his name Perez. Afterward his brother came out with the scarlet thread on his hand, and she called his name Zerah. So now Tamar gives birth to two sons. And the reason or the place where this ties into the New Testament is in the genealogy of Christ. So in the genealogy of Christ, in the Gospel of Matthew, we have the whole list of Christ's ancestors from the time of Abraham all the way down to the time of Jesus. And at the beginning, so this is the first chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. We read, "This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers." So this Judah in Christ's genealogy is the same Judah that we just read about, who impregnated his daughter-in-law, Tamar. And Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. So this story is referenced in the genealogy of Christ, because Perez is the father of Hezron, Hezron is the father of Ram, etc., 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 and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. So this story is the story of the birth of one of Christ's, great, like to the 38th generation ancestors. So this story is actually a family story of Jesus, that this family line from Judah going down, that his family line actually goes through this story in the 38th chapter of Genesis. So what does this mean, right? What does this mean? first of all, Christ chooses to come into this family line, right? Jesus, as God, he can pick and choose where he wants to enter into history, and he chooses this family with this kind of speckled history. So, what does that mean? It means that Christ comes into the world in its brokenness. He doesn't wait, he doesn't wait for, he doesn't look for kind of the easy path, or he doesn't look for simple perfection across the board, even though his mother, the Virgin Mary, is, of course, we believe her to be sinless, and, at least by willing sin, she didn't commit any. But he comes into this, family line that really shows the brokenness of humanity, that really shows the sin, right? The disease of that first sin, the sickness of the first sin that we read about in Genesis chapter 3 all those sessions ago, is where he comes into play, is where Jesus comes into the picture. So it really gives us the context for the whole ministry of Jesus, that Jesus has come into this reality, right? Into this family where this really strange and awkward story took place. And that has all these, sinful people as part of the bloodline. Like, David is one of his forefathers as well, who commits adultery and murder. And there's others as well along the way in his story and his genealogy, that are sinners. I mean, they commit very serious sins. But Jesus comes into that to bring wholeness and healing to our fallen humanity. So this same problem that was posed in the third chapter of this book, and the third chapter of Genesis, is exactly what Christ is coming to answer. He's coming to answer the problem of our fallen nature. So even though this story is definitely uncomfortable to read, and definitely has that, soap opera drama factor, it really gives us the context of who Jesus is and what his ministry and purpose is in the world. And that's to make us whole again, even in our extreme brokenness. So after that, one chapter kind of break from the action. After that halftime show, so to speak, although this story is the story of Joseph is not half done at all. We get to chapter 39, and we're back in Egypt now with Joseph. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, Pharaoh's eunuch and captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. So now he finds himself in the house of one of Pharaoh's eunuchs, a captain of the guard. So this person has some authority in Egypt. He's not someone to be trifled with. In verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was living in the house of his lord the Egyptian. So his lord, meaning Potiphar, saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord made all he did prosper in his hand. Thus Joseph found grace in his sight and was pleasing to him. Then he made him overseer of his house and put everything he had under Joseph's authority. So it was from the time he made him overseer of his house and all he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all he had in Joseph's hand and did not know what he had except for the bread he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. So Joseph now is still a slave in Egypt, but he's doing quite well. He finds grace. He finds a place there. He's successful. His lord Potiphar sees that God is with him, and everything begins to flourish. And so he puts his whole household really in the charge of Joseph. And so Joseph now is overseeing his whole house, to the point where Potiphar doesn't even know what's going on. He trusts Joseph so implicitly that he has no idea what's happening in his household except for what he's eating at his table. And I think that the takeaway point there is that when people are close to God, it shows, right? It shows to the people around us. Potiphar does not worship the one true God of Israel, right? But he sees that this Joseph person is blessed and that God is walking with him everywhere he goes. So it reminds me a lot of the stories of the saints of our time, especially. So, for example, You have the lives of Saint Paisios, the Athonite, and Saint Iakovos of Evia, who both died in the 90s and in Greece. And they were monks. They lived in isolation, and yet thousands and thousands of people flocked to them for their blessings, to get their advice, to just to be in their presence. Because to be in their presence was to be in God's presence. It emanates, it emanates. When someone is really holy, when someone is really close to God and is a God bearer, especially someone who has God in their heart, it comes through in everything that they do. And so again, to be in their presence is really to be in the presence of God. And so again, thousands and thousands of people. Saint Porphyrios is another person. Saint Nectarius of Egina, right? Like these are saints who lived in our modern day, who people from all over the world came to visit them because of their holiness and their righteousness. So in the same way that their holiness and their closeness with God just kind of exudes out and draws people to them, that's kind of what's happening here in Joseph's story. That now Potiphar sees very clearly, and it's abundantly clear, that Joseph is close to God, and so everything that Joseph is doing is prospering and is just flourishing. So he's, in a very wise move, says, "Okay, Joseph, you're in charge of everything," and his whole household begins to flourish as well. So Joseph is doing just great. And as he matures, it says he's handsome in form and appearance. So everything's going really well, but now there's going to be a problem. So in verse 7, we see we're gonna get to the next scene of the soap opera. So then it came to pass after these things that his Lord's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." So now this is Potiphar's wife. She's making advances towards Joseph, and Joseph at this time probably is like 16 years old. He's a young boy, but he's maturing. But she looks on him with lustful eyes. But he refused, and said to his Lord's wife, "Look, my Lord does not know what is with me in the house, and has committed all he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me, but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" So he says, the only thing that I'm not in charge of in this house is you, because you're his wife. So how can I do this thing to totally betray my master and to sin against God? So he refuses her. And it's interesting because in a usual like servant, master relation, it's usually the master that tells the servant what's right and wrong. But in this case, you have now the slave, Joseph is a slave, telling the master's wife, what his moral compass is telling him. So it's important to note that Joseph's virtue in this situation really shines through once again, even in these very difficult moments. So he refuses her. So in verse 10, we see that she's not going to give up. So it was as she spoke to Joseph day by day. So every day she's talking to him, making advances, that he did not heed her to lie with her or to have relations with her. He's like, "No, get away from me," because he knows that this is not pleasing to the eyes of God, and it would be a betrayal of his master as well. So in verse 11, but it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." So he's in the house by himself, he's just doing his work, and she grabs him. She like grabs his clothes, and she says, "Lie with me." She tries once again. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. So he strips himself, like he like undoes his clothes and so he can get out of her grip, and he just runs. He just gets out of there. He gets the heck out of there, because for him, it's more important to not do the sin, right? It's more important not to commit the sin than it is to even to preserve his dignity, right? Like for him, it's more important to get out of that situation, that temptation of sin, than it is for him to walk outside with clothes on. He'd rather run through the neighborhood naked than fall into this temptation presented by Potiphar's wife. Now, Potiphar's wife has a problem though, because now she has Joseph's clothes in her hands, So that would be an interesting story, to have to explain. So she, her cunningness, her cunning knows no end, as we see in verse 13. So it was when she saw he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, "See, he brought into us a Hebrew to mock us. He came into me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. Thus it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. So she kept his garment with her until his Lord came home. Then she spoke to him with words like these, saying, the Hebrew servant you brought to us came in to me to mock me. So it happened as I lifted my voice and cried out, he left his garment with me and fled outside." So she puts it on him. She says he was making advances towards me, and I cried out for help, and he ran away naked. So it was when his Lord heard the words his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner. His anger was aroused. Then Joseph's Lord took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined. So here's yet again where we see the story of Joseph and the story of Jesus kind of paralleling one another and mirroring one another to the point where Joseph really becomes a type. It really becomes a typology for the story of Christ and what's going to happen later. If we think about it in the last time we saw Joseph in chapter 37, he's wrongly accused, or he's sold into slavery by his brothers for 20 pieces of silver. Christ also was given over by one of his brothers, one of his disciples, for 30 pieces of silver to the Pharisees. And Joseph was sold into slavery, and Christ was sold into imprisonment. Here we have also the false accusations, right? Just like Joseph here is falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, and he goes into prison for it. So too, Jesus is falsely accused by the Pharisees of blaspheming, because they don't understand that he is a truly God. So, so Joseph now goes into prison, just like Christ also goes into prison. And really, for Joseph, this is a time where we see him go into the jail, and we'll see what happens to him while he's there. But this really is symbolic or reminiscent of now Christ's death and burial. So Christ dies. He's an innocent man, and yet he's convicted by Pilate and by the Jewish leadership, and he's put on the cross, and he dies, and he goes into the tomb. And now we have Joseph, who is wrongly accused, and he goes now into jail, into the darkness, into the dank prisons. And so we have kind of, again, the stories paralleling and becoming a typology for Christ. So Joseph is a kind of a fundamental story of the Old Testament when it comes to the foreshadowing of what's going to happen to Jesus as well. And we'll see that it continues, that it's not just in this imprisonment, but also in the glorification, that Joseph also becomes a type for Christ as well. So at the end of chapter 39, we read, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him grace in the sight of the chief prison keeper. So the chief keeper of the prison put under Joseph's authority both the prison and all the prisoners and whatever they did there. So Joseph has so much grace, again, right? The chief jailer sees that Joseph is a man of grace and has God with him, and he's in charge of the prison and all the prisoners. So again, we see Joseph, even in this horrible situation, he's flourishing, and he is placed in a position of authority because of his great virtue and grace and his closeness with God. Verse 23, the chief keeper of the prison did not look into anything under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. So just like with Potiphar, how Potiphar had no idea what was going on in his own house because he trusted Joseph so implicitly, we have the same thing going on now in prison. This is a reminder, too, for us that righteousness before God doesn't necessarily mean that life will be easy or comfortable, or that we won't fall into problems, or that unjust things will not happen to us, right? Like as Christians, as Orthodox Christians, we are definitely not preachers of the prosperity gospel, that if we live a good life and we don't sin, that God will bless us with riches and comfort and all these other things. That's not something we ascribe to at all. We've seen this already with Abraham, right? Abraham was faithful to God. He always trusted God, that God would come through. And yet it took years and years and adventure after adventure for the promises to start coming true. And so we have here Joseph, who's very virtuous, very righteous, as we've seen now with Potiphar's wife. And he falls into all these troubles. He's sold into slavery, and now he's in prison in his slavery as well. So it's a reminder that we can't just expect things always to be, happy and easy for us just because we're Christians or because we are faithful. That God allows these situations sometimes, not only in the scriptures but in our own life, so that our virtue can shine out. As we'll see here in the story of Joseph, even in this very difficult scenario, his virtue will shine out very brightly. So we get to verse 40 now, Joseph in the prison, or chapter 40. This is Joseph in the prison. Now it came to pass after these things that the king of Egypt's chief cupbearer and chief baker offended their lord, the king of Egypt. So Pharaoh was angry with his two eunuchs, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. Thus he put them in custody with the chief bodyguard in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. Then the chief jailer committed them to Joseph, and he attended them. So they were in custody for a while. So now there's two new prisoners, and they are both servants of Pharaoh. We have his cupbearer, the one who brings him his cup of wine, and we have also his baker. So these are two new prisoners. Then the king of Egypt's chief cupbearer and chief baker, who were confined in the prison, had a dream, both of them. Each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. So on the same night, they both have a dream, and they're having trouble figuring out what it means. So Joseph came to them in the morning and looked at them and saw they were troubled. Thus he asked Pharaoh's eunuchs who were with him in the custody of his lord, saying, "Why do you look so sad today?" So they said to him, "We each had a dream, and there is no one to interpret it." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Therefore relate them to me." So we saw early in this story of Joseph that Joseph interprets his own dreams, that he's a dreamer and has visions in his dreams, and he interprets them as well. But now we're going to see Joseph interpret the dreams of others. But the interesting thing about Joseph here, once again, is that he doesn't ascribe that gift to himself. He says, don't the interpretations of dreams belong to God? And so even in this, Joseph is very humble. He doesn't say, "Oh yes, I interpret dreams. Tell me what you saw." He says, "Well, isn't that God's job to interpret our dreams? Tell me what you see." So we see Joseph's humility before God, and that he doesn't take the credit himself, but ascribes that gift to God himself. So now let's see what the dreams were. In verse 9, then the chief cupbearer related his dream to Joseph and said to him, "Behold, in my dream a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." And Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days Pharaoh will remember your position and restore your office of chief cupbearer, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his cupbearer. But remember me when it is well with you, and have mercy on me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and I also have done nothing for them to put me into the dungeon." So that's the first dream. The cupbearer dreams he sees a vine with 3 branches, and they sprout forth grapes, and he presses them into Pharaoh's cup, and he puts it in Pharaoh's hand. And he says, "You will be restored to your position, but don't forget me. Remember me and get me out of this prison." Now in verse 16, let's see what the baker's dream was. When the chief baker saw the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, "I also had a dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head. So Joseph answered and said, "This is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you." So the baker's interpretation is not good. Joseph predicts that he will meet his end in 3 days' time. So now in verse 20, we see if Joseph was right. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants. And he remembered the positions of his chief cupbearer and chief baker among his servants. Then he restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So even though Joseph was right and he correctly interprets the dreams, the cupbearer forgets about Joseph. And he ends up remaining in prison for 2 more years. Now, St. John Chrysostom writes about this, interestingly, that it's God who allows Joseph to stay in prison for even longer, so that when the right time presents itself, his wisdom and his virtue will be revealed in an even more excellent and more glorious way. It'll happen at the exact right moment, so that when he is called out of prison, he will save all of Egypt, which is what we're going to see in the very next chapter. So it's interesting that St. John ascribes the forgetfulness of the cupbearer really to the work of God, to the providence of God, that he was forgotten for those 2 years because it wasn't the right time. And we'll see what that right time was as we get into chapter 41. Then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years, so he's in extra 2 more years in prison, that Pharaoh had a dream. So now Pharaoh's having a dream. And behold, he stood by the river. Suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine looking and fat, and they were fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. So we have 7 fat cows and 7 hungry cows. They look like they're starving. But the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. So Pharaoh awoke. He slept and dreamed a second dream. And suddenly 7 ears of corn came up on one stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 ears of corn, thin and blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. But the 7 thin ears of corn devoured the 7 plump and full ears. So Pharaoh awoke, and indeed it was a dream. So he has kind of these 2 parallel dreams where 7 good versions come and 7 bad versions come, and the bad versions eat the good versions of either the cows or the corn. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the interpreters of Egypt and all its wise men. Thus Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. And now the time will come for Joseph's wisdom to be revealed. Then the cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my sin this day. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the chief bodyguard, both myself and the chief baker, we each had a dream in one night, both he and I. Each had a dream regarding himself. Now there was with us a young Hebrew servant of the chief bodyguard, and we related our dreams to him, and he interpreted them for us. And it came to pass just as he interpreted for us. So it happened. He restored me to my office, but he hanged him. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon. And he shaved, changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. Thus Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. But I heard it was said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. So here again, Joseph ascribes the ability to interpret dreams to God and not to himself. So Pharaoh explains the dream again from verse 17 related to verse 24. So we don't have to read that again. It's literally almost word for word the same. So we'll pick up in verse 25. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do, meaning what God is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears of corn are 7 years. The dreams are one. But the 7 thin and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty heads blighted by the east wind are 7 years of famine. This is the thing I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all of the land of Egypt. But after them 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following it, for it will be very severe. Now the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice, because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now therefore let Pharaoh select a sensible and intelligent man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint governors over the land, to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. So let them gather all the food of the 7 good years that are coming, and store up grain under Pharaoh's authority, and let them keep food in the cities. That food shall then be as a reserve in the land for the 7 coming years of famine in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. So by Joseph's interpretation, he gives Pharaoh a plan for how to get through the 7 horrible years of famine, because the famine, Joseph says, will be very severe. It's not just going to be like a little famine, it's going to be 7 long years of famine. So Joseph is able to give him a game plan for how Egypt is going to survive through these 7 years of terrible famine. So we see now again the wisdom, the virtue of Joseph shining out in a situation, in a time, in a place where the other wise men of Egypt, right, his other interpreters and his other wise men, were unable to tell him what the dreams meant. So this little Hebrew boy from the land of Israel, from the land of Canaan, I should say, it's not known as Israel yet, is able to interpret his dream in a place where all these wise men of Egypt, are not able to. So it really shows again the greatness of God and how God's grace is guiding Joseph in everything that he does. So now let's see what happens to Joseph, and we'll tie it back. We'll finish off by tying it really back into to Christ once again. So in verse 37 of chapter 41, now this advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. Thus Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a man as this, who has the Spirit of God in him? So there you go again. Pharaoh recognizes that God is with Joseph, and it shines out, right? There's no question about it. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as sensible and intelligent as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took the signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. Then he had him ride in the second of his chariots, and they cried out before him, bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paaneah, and gave him as a wife Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, a priest of On. So here we have, out of prison, literally, newly out of prison, Joseph becomes the number 2 in all of Egypt. He's the right-hand man of Pharaoh. He's dressed gloriously. He's given fine clothes to wear, rings, gold jewelry, and he has total authority in Egypt, only surpassed by Pharaoh. So again, this is where St. John Chrysostom was talking about how this was God's providence, that he waited for this exact moment. And now in the end, it turned out even better for Joseph, that now he has been placed over all the land of Egypt. He's been given authority over all the land of Egypt. Now this really for us, the typology between Joseph and Christ really continues here. Because just as Christ out of the tomb gives life and light and hope to all its people and comes out of the darkness of death glorious and resplendent and shining, so brightly. This is exactly what's happening here in Joseph. He comes out of prison. He saves Egypt from certain famine, right? From perishing from the famine. He gives them light and hope that they can endure and get through this. And he comes out of the darkness of the dungeons, and he's just glorious, you know. So you have this exact prototype of the resurrection here in the Joseph story, that out of this horrible, difficult time in the jails of Egypt, there's this glory and hope and life. And that's exactly what we see in the life of Christ and in the death and resurrection of Christ. And so Joseph and Jesus really have so much in common. Their stories have so much in common. And it's beautiful for us to see these stories play out thousands of years before the coming of the Messiah, and then to be, you know, fulfilled, to be brought into their fullness in the New Testament as well. So now let's finish off chapter 41, and then we'll stop there for today. Now Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh the king. 30 years old. So he's still a young man, which is also actually, if you think about it, that's the age that Christ begins his earthly ministry. That's when Christ is baptized in the Jordan River. He's 30 years old. Then Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. Now in the 7 plentiful years, the ground brought forth abundantly. So he gathered up all the food of the 7 years of prosperity in the land of Egypt and stored the food in the cities. He laid up in every city the food of the fields that surrounded them. Joseph gathered very much grain as the sand of the sea until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. The next little section there, I'm going to skip over. It talks about his sons. Joseph has 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and those 2 sons will actually become leaders of some of the tribes of Israel as well. And then in verse 53, we continue now to see kind of where the end of this famine takes place. Verse 53, then the 7 years of plenty in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph said. The famine was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So in other words, all the surrounding nations were starving. You know, they were suffering through this famine. But in Egypt they had food because of Joseph's foresight, because of the grace of God who allowed him to interpret Pharaoh's dream, the providence of God for Pharaoh to have the dream and to have Joseph interpret it. And so there's food in Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph, whatever he says to you, do. The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. Then all countries also came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all the earth. So even though the rest of the world is suffering, Egypt is doing just fine, because they've been planning for 7 years about what they were going to do when this famine comes. So Joseph really, again, his virtue, his foresight, his wisdom really shine out and saves Egypt, right? Like he saves the Egyptians from certain destruction. So we'll stop there for tonight. Next week we'll get farther into it and see kind of how Joseph and his brothers are reunited, and see how that goes, and we'll see how the typology of Christ continues with Joseph as well. If anyone has any questions at this time, please feel free to unmute yourself, and then you can ask your question. If not, we'll depart for the evening. Remember, you can always, if you have questions afterwards, you think of something, you can always email me, send me a Facebook message. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. So don't be afraid. Even if you don't want to ask the question in the group, you can always shoot me a question later, and I'd be happy to answer it. Thank you all for participating tonight, for being attentive. We'll continue next week, God willing, on our normal Tuesday night schedule. Hopefully we'll get back to normal. And again, we're getting close. We just finished chapter 41. There's 50 chapters in Genesis, so another 2 or 3 sessions, and we'll get to the finish line there. So have a blessed night, everyone. Take care. Thank you again for your participation, and may God bless you all.
Good night. Thank you.